Dick felt mildly happy now. At least having to go to the butcher's shop would give him a good excuse to attend to his own little tasks in town. If only Grace knew what he got up to half the time, he thought, shaking his head in disbelief. She'd have my guts for garters. The trouble was, Grace knew exactly how her husband chose to spend his time. As Dick struggled into his jacket, there was a loud rap on the back door. Opening it, he was greeted by the smiling face of Robbie Powell, who, as promised, was holding a large basket of fresh seafood in his arms. "All right, Dick," the lad chuckled, seeing Dick still entangled with the sleeve of his jacket. "Let me put this down and help you with that." "Ah, thanks, Robbie. Bloody thing's getting too small. I reckon Grace shrunk it in the wash." Robbie laughed and kept his thoughts to himself. He hadn't seen Dick for a couple of weeks, and was surprised to see that the older man's waistline had expanded quite significantly. Just then, almost as if she had sensed her husband using her name in vain, Grace appeared through the other door. She was holding a battered leather purse in her hand. "Hello, Robbie, love," she grinned. "Is that our fish for tonight's supper?" Robbie nodded and placed the basket on the draining board. "It certainly is, Mrs. T." Grace simultaneously counted out money to give to Dick to buy the lamb, and paid the fisherman what she owed for the mackerel and prawns. "Have you got time for a cuppa and a slice of walnut cake?" Grace offered kindly, knowing that Robbie had probably come straight up from his boat and wouldn't have stopped for a drink or a bite to eat yet. "Aye, go on then," Robbie replied, rubbing his hands together. There was nothing he liked more than a big wedge of Mrs. Thomas's cake. She baked almost as well as his granny. "Sit down then," she fussed, putting on the kettle and reaching for a tea plate on which to put the cake. Dick could see that he wasn't needed and said his goodbyes, thankful that Robbie was there, thus avoiding any last-minute sarcasm from his wife. "So," the young man smiled, "what's on the agenda for this weekend then? Lots of guests and lots of cooking to do?" Grace replied in the affirmative, and proceeded to tell Robbie all about the regular guests that would be staying this weekend, and the new couple whom she knew nothing about except that they'd just got married and had chosen the Sandybank Guest House as their honeymoon location. With the fish put away in the refrigerator, tea poured and walnut cake served, the conversation took an unexpected turn. "So, what do you think will happen to Margaret and Brett?" Robbie asked, unexpectedly pulling Grace's Mills and Boone saga towards him. "Gosh," was all Grace could say, quite taken aback by the young man's interest in her book. "Do you think Stephen is a long-lost relative or something?" Robbie continued, quite oblivious to the shocked look that Grace was giving him. "Or is he an ex-lover?" "Well," started Grace, suddenly realizing that Robbie must have actually read this book to know so much about the characters. "I'm not sure." Robbie looked a little disappointed at Grace's apparent lack of interest and pushed the novel away. "I'm sorry," Grace apologized. "I just didn't think that would be the sort of thing that young men read." "I'm full of surprises." Robbie winked cheekily. "And I love these romantic sagas, I do." And so, for another half hour, Robbie and Grace discussed the plot and characters, other books that they'd both read by the same author, and how lovely it was to get away from real life sometimes. All of a sudden, the telephone rang, interrupting their chatter. Grace excused herself and walked into the hallway to answer it. With the door still ajar, Robbie could hear Grace talking earnestly. "Yes, that's right," she was saying. "He left here last Thursday morning." There was a pause as the person on the other end of the line talked. "Oh dear," Grace replied. "I'm sorry to hear that. I'm afraid I don't know what to say." There was silence again while Grace listened. She then wrote something down on a little notepad. "Well, if I think of anything, I'll give you a call," she finished, preparing to hang up. "Goodbye." She stood perfectly still in the hallway for a few seconds before composing herself and returning to the kitchen. What a strange call, she thought.